Welcome back, everybody. We're on to week 2, our first online week. I hope you all had a good weekend. It was nice meeting everybody last week. And this week, we're going to talk about the history of private security. And as I told you, these first couple weeks can be a little bit on the dry side. But there are some kind of cool things that you'll pick up on here. And I've got an assignment for you. I was originally going to have you do a piece of writing this week, but you just got back, you're getting into your new classes and everything, so I decided we're going to do a quiz instead. My quizzes are only 10 questions. And by the way, I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I picked up a little cold from being around all you germ factories last week. So if I have to stop and cough or whatever, I apologize. But the history of private security has some really interesting parts to it, though, that are kind of like gee whiz kind of stuff. And heck, if it just gets you one question right on Jeopardy sometime in the future, well, then it's time well spent. So if we're talking about the history of private security and the history of security in general, let's go back in time. So where do we start? Well, meet Fred. Fred is your average, everyday caveman. And, Fred is not the brightest guy around. Hasn't had a lot of schoolhousing because those haven't been invented yet. But Fred really just has to worry about, a few things. But those few things are things that keep him alive or make him very dead. And we don't want a dead Fred. So what does Fred have to worry about? Well, Fred has to worry about Gladys. Cavemen had to worry about dinosaurs, right? Or maybe not dinosaurs, maybe some other type of wild animal. But you get the picture. Fred didn't have to worry about getting run over by a bus. Fred didn't have to worry about whether the electric bill was paid. Fred didn't have to worry about getting stabbed while walking through Central Park at night. Fred had to worry about a wild animal taking what was Fred's. And that's what motivated Fred to think about his own security. And it's that simple. And I say this and I kind of, you look at it and you say, wow, this guy thinks we're in kindergarten. But I think you have to think about security in that fashion. It is such a basic human need, as Dr. Maslow told us, that we have to keep it in our minds as a basic human need, and therefore not skimp on its importance when we go forward. Otherwise, we could be like Fred. So all Fred had to do was protect himself from harm. He needed to protect his food and his shelter from theft or destruction. And make no mistake, Gladys is often hungry. Wouldn't mind rummaging through what Fred's got, and wouldn't mind if, indeed, what's in Fred's refrigerator isn't of her liking, she'd go ahead and eat Fred. So realistically, what we're talking about here is asset protection. There were assets and resources that Fred defined as valuable. His food source, his shelter, his basic tools that he had to do what he needed to do to be Fred and not be dead. Fred saw Gladys as a threat. Fred presumed his assets, those things he valued, were vulnerable to Gladys. So he grabbed his trusty club and anything else he could do to try to get away from Gladys. That's it, in a nutshell. There were assets. There were threats. Fred saw a vulnerability, so he picked up the club to try to even the score a little bit, and therefore he managed the risk. That's all risk management is. A valuable asset, a threat to that asset, a vulnerability or something that could cause that asset to be threatened even more, and closing of that, identifying that risk and closing that risk. So I propose to you, ladies and gentlemen, that all Fred was doing was exactly what we do today with more, we'll call it more significant risks, although Fred was going to lose his life, so I don't know how much more significant you can get than that. But for society, we do the exact same thing. We have an asset, be it our homeland. There's a threat, terroristic threat perhaps. We have a vulnerability. Perhaps it's border screening. Perhaps it is our cyber systems and vulnerabilities to our critical infrastructure. Any number of vulnerabilities. And as security experts, we simply try to operate in that little red zone and mitigate that risk. So I further propose that it doesn't matter whether you are a homeland security person, a private security person, a cybersecurity person, or any other person who's responsible for the security of yourself or others. It's the same basic formula. You have an asset, it's being threatened. There's something that's causing it to be threatened because it's got a weakness somewhere, and that's what the risk is, and you go close that, you mitigate that risk, you fix the red intersection, and that is what the job is that anyone going into any form of security, that is their job, to mitigate the risks, to identify them and mitigate the risks. So the motivation and reason behind private security, which is what Fred was practicing, his own form of private security, has not changed. Now the approaches to mitigation change. We would no longer see a wild animal coming at us and pick up a club, unless that's all we had. We would probably more proactively have a firearm with us, or a trap with us, or some other way of disposing of that threat. But private security simply mitigates the stuff in the red zone. And the kind of tools private security uses to fix that are a little bit different today. And that's really what the evolution in the history of the private security industry is. It's the evolution of those tools. Generally speaking, we can close any risk, right? We can close the vulnerabilities and mitigate the risk using the security triad: physical security, personnel security, and informational security. Now, you notice I say informational, and by that, I'll go deeper into the definition, but don't think narrowly as cybersecurity as the only form of information security, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. But if you use these three factors, these three toolboxes, if you will, you can pretty much mitigate any security risk. So the first toolbox in our triad is physical security. Now, I just made it first. It could be third. It could be second. One is not more important than the other. And in fact, if you have a proper balance between the three, you are putting yourself in a much better position to mitigate risk. But physical security, think of as the word devices. Any device you use would be a physical security feature. So think in the modern day, locks and fences, cameras to some extent, although they can be used for other purposes. But weapons? Sure. Fred's club was a physical security device, and it was used to protect his life or his property. Physical security is the most visible that you will see. It is also the one that offers the best way to layer your mitigations. There's only just so many things you can do in the others, but physical security has a lot of ways you can attack things, a lot of ways you can prevent attacks from things. And so it's kind of an interesting part of the security triad. It's one that I'm a little biased toward myself because it's the one I have the most experience with too. So, take that for what it is. But as these tools, these devices get more and more toward the cyber side of things, you will find some convergence of cybersecurity and physical security as important and beneficial, which is why I'm glad we've got so many cybersecurity people taking this course. Don't look at it as just a ticking the box kind of thing. There is a very large, I'll call it a niche industry, but niche tends to mean that it's very small and specialized, but a very large shared mission in physical security and devices between those with computer science degrees and those with security degrees. The second leg, if you will, of our triad is personnel security. Really, personnel security is the protection of people without those devices. So the most glaring, the one that really stands out is things like executive protection. Use of a guard force would be personnel security. Now, they may be used to support the physical side. So, for instance, you have a camera system and you pick up something on the camera. It's alarmed. It has infrared sensor, motion sensor of some kind, and it picks up activity, and you look on the camera and you see an adversary coming toward your asset. Well, then you would kick in the personnel security of a guard force response. So they kind of blend in that regard. But it's probably the most visible, and that is because it's people. And think about executive protection. When you thought about private security, when you signed up to the course, I will venture to say that more than half of you said, we're going to talk about bodyguards. Well, we will a little bit, but not a lot. But generally speaking, executive protection and guard response is very visible. But also things like background checks And in fact, in the cybersecurity world, personnel assurity is probably one of your biggest tools. Think of it this way. You can put all of the firewalls in the world in place, but somebody has the key to the box. Someone is the cybersecurity person or the chief security officer or even a middle manager in your computer science section of your entity, your business, your organization. They're going to know how to get around those things. The people who put them in know how to get around them. You, generally speaking, will not put in security protections on a computer system or on an entity without someone knowing how to shut them off if necessary. Background checks help assure that the person that you're putting in that responsible place does not have a history of doing harm to people by being in such a responsible place. And then you have private investigations, and they do some of that same type of stuff, if you will, of checking on personal surety, making sure people are who they say they are, do what they say they've done, and don't have a history of doing things that could harm you. And finally, our third leg is informational security. And informational security is a term that's used in your book, actually. Dr. Jasky used it. And I asked him when I last spoke to him, because I was looking over the book again, and I said, why did you use informational rather than information security? I mean, information security rolls off the tongue. It's used all the time. Why'd you use it? He said, because informational, the AL, makes things all encompassing. It's the root word, right? And he was thinking more along the lines of not simply, here's the information and we have to protect it by, encrypting it and password protecting it and doing all kinds of other things that you cyber guys do very, very well. But also think about the processes, and informational security in this regard takes on those processes. So, for instance, the Internal Revenue Service has personally identifiable information. For those who are not familiar, personally identifiable information is a combination of certain pieces of information on a person where you could then assign a name to an activity. So if, we have my name and my date of birth and my social security number, the easiest way to think about it would be if you had enough information where you could apply and potentially be successful in getting credit in someone's name, you have enough personally identifiable information to show a breach. So, companies have long had a problem with, they collect information on people and you're required to protect that information. And people in cybersecurity fields put all kinds of things in place to make sure that outside people can't get that information. But what about social engineering? What about a person who just calls up and says, hey, is this Brian? Yeah, it is. Hey, I'm Joe over in the accounting department, and my system's down, and I'm trying to process bonus payments for people. You got the security records on people, don't you? Yeah, I do. Do you happen to have social security numbers? Yeah, I do, because, we're using our cards for, charge accounts as well, because it's got a chip in it, so they use it for charging stuff in the cafeteria and things like that, so I'm required to have that. Oh, okay, can you do me a favor? Look up Bill Jones' social security number. Let me have that, because I can't process his check, and the poor guy, it's almost Christmas, and I really like to get this nice check. Of course, Brian's going to probably be a nice guy and do a dumb thing and give up Bill's social security number. All the cybersecurity in the world is not going to necessarily help you with that, right? Processes for release of information, processes for the storage of information in hard copy, those are the types of things that informational security really takes in on top of cybersecurity that are much harder to control because people are involved in it and people are messy. So now we know our triad. We know that physical security are those devices, those alarms and cameras and card reader systems and locks and fences and all those good things to keep people in, keep people out. We know that personnel security is the response force that tries to mitigate the risk once it's detected through those other systems. We know that it also is trying to make sure that only the right people get to do the right things because we're looking into their background and their own history to see what they're up to. And we know informational security takes in cybersecurity, probably the biggest and most important part of it. But any weak link in a system like that, no matter how good your cybersecurity is, involves people giving up information on their own. They have to have it in order to do their job. Someone convinces them to give it up in some fashion, or they don't store it properly, or they don't protect it properly when they have it in their possession. That's the informational security side. So we know that those are really the three big things that make up private security. But let's talk a little bit about where this stuff came from originally, and maybe looking at that helps us understand why it's grown or how it was grown. So physical security, well, we kind of know where it came from. It came from Fred, right? Cavemen. I mean, it started when people started. You had to have ways to protect yourself from an adversary who wanted to get to your assets, namely your food and shelter and clothing and anything else that kept you alive. And you had to have a way to mitigate that risk. Physical security is what you had. You certainly weren't going to run a background check on Gladys, although I would suggest that observing those animals and learning what they were after and where they went and how they lived was part of a surveillance that was actually doing some form of rudimentary background check. So that's kind of weird, but fortress builders, right? The early castles, all built in a way so that they couldn't be penetrated using physical security features like the height of a wall, places on the top so that arrows can be shot down onto people, using stone instead of wood because it's less penetrable and normally would not burn. There are so many different examples of physical security as we went along. As people started to build things, they started to think about how to protect themselves from the different risks that were out there. And even the early Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans used locks, actual padlocks. There are padlocks that are thousands of years old. Very rudimentary, obviously, hand forged. But when we talk about modern physical security, one of the first really were burglar alarms. And burglar alarms were invented very early in the game. A man named August Pope invented the burglar alarm, and all it was a set of magnetic contacts that, when separated, two pieces of wire essentially, when you separated them, caused an alarm. So the separation of two pieces of wire actually caused the connection of another set of contacts, which caused an alarm. And Pope invented this, didn't see a future in it, and sold it to Edwin Holmes. Holmes started selling these devices in New York City to very wealthy homeowners around the Gilded Age, because New York City was a dichotomy of the very, very rich and the very, very poor. And the very, very rich were very opulent with their wealth, artwork, gold work, the Gilded Age, even by definition, right? Gilded, gold. So he started selling these to wealthy homeowners, who in turn then were bankers and railroadmen and steelmen. And they saw the utility of using these alarms in their businesses and then especially in their banks. Now, Holmes had wiring then running from all of these homes and businesses and banks back to his monitoring station. He had to run dedicated wire to do that. So, set a twisted pair of wires running from a bank downtown across through wherever, other buildings, underground, wherever, back to central stations, where Holmes people could then have the alarm come in, or just wiring running to the outside of the building with a bell on it, which was very common in early days of bank alarms, where when somebody robbed the bank, you'll see this in old gangster movies, they'll rob the bank and then you'll hear a really loud bell. That was to tell the local cop the bank was being robbed, and all he had to do is listen for the bell. But there was beginning to be a very large set of wires. Now, Holmes in New York met with another New Yorker, Alexander Graham Bell, and sold the rights to use all that alarm exchanges and wiring for a telephone system. So if you think about it, the burglar alarm system was out before telephones and was the backbone for the first telephone systems 100 years ago. Holmes then, after selling those rights and taking a royalty, of course, to Bell, eventually outright sold his company to the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T. And AT&T is still actively in the alarm and alarm monitoring business today. Now, personnel security really involves the protection of people through guarding and defense, early personnel security. You didn't have background checks. You didn't have background checks. Why? Because record keeping was very limited. Most records before the last really 150 years were kept by historians. So you'd only have really big events, right? Church records, birth records, marriage records, death records were church records, all kept by hand. Churches being detached to the United States, where you, not like the Church of England, where, all the churches are connected in some way. Most of them were. In the United States, certainly people came for religious freedom, and different sects of different religions came up, so they weren't connected. And then other records like arrest records and court records, trials, hangings, were all kept locally. It would not be kept, records would not be kept in Washington, D.C. about who was hung in Cheyenne, Wyoming in a certain year. Those records would be kept in the Cheyenne courthouse. And if somebody wanted to know if someone was hung in Cheyenne, they'd go to Cheyenne to look up that record. We did not have the connectivity in any fashion, nor did we have the utility to do it, obviously, right? You weren't hopping on the internet in 1862, and so these records were just not available. So background checks are relatively new. So really think of early personnel security in terms of fighting forces, almost like small armies, or in some cases, the armies themselves. Now, the Greeks and Romans, as early as 700 BC, which is long after Fred, right, formed personnel units, if you will, and they were formed to protect the ruling class. They roamed the streets of Athens and other Greek cities and of Rome, looking for people doing things wrong, looking for the signs of people trying to penetrate the cities, and they did so to protect the ruling class. Now, they were kind of like a police force, if you think about it, roaming the city to protect those of wealth by keeping an eye on the city itself and those without wealth. And in some ways, those without wealth gained the benefit of that because there were patrols going through their cities. And then early police forces really took shape then during the Middle Ages, and more policing, patrol, and arrest functions happened then. At that point, I think in many cases, these people who were doing these patrols realized that the threat came from internally rather than externally. Now, after the fall of Rome, the Anglo-Saxons followed something called the Franken Pledge. And the Franken Pledge, by definition, was all adult men are responsible for public security. Therefore, everybody took their turn and did their patrols of the streets. So when it was your turn, you would be up all night patrolling the streets, kind of like a police department. And that went on for centuries, actually. But during the English Reformation, later private security forces became paid, and public funds were used to protect citizens. And that became the model for modern public policing. But they were done by private citizens. They weren't sworn police officers. They were simply people who went and got a job, and maybe they did it for a while and then came back and did it for another while. And their job was simply to protect the citizenry. Now, public policing really in the United States was not really a big thing, certainly during the American Revolution period. And it really started to form slightly thereafter. And Alan Pinkerton became a major player in the formation of private security by his connections to police work, which is why today I think we still see the connection, and people think of security as being part of the criminal justice system. Obviously it is, but I think that all came really from this beginning in the United States. Alan Pinkerton, an interesting guy. He was fired from the Chicago Police Department in 1850 and decided to form his own private detective agency, the very first one in the United States. That's at least on record. Now, police were considered really corrupt in the mid-1800s, extremely corrupt. You basically could buy a cop and do what you wanted to do. If you had enough money to pay the policeman, you had free rein to do what you wanted to do. And it was not even really frowned upon. It was really part of the model. right? The poor couldn't pay the police, therefore the poor were watched more. They were more likely to commit crime, so they were being watched. And if you didn't want to be watched, then you just paid for the privilege of not being watched. Also in the 1800s, we didn't have the large federal law enforcement contingents we have today, and one of them was the Secret Service. It had not yet been devised. And Allan Pinkerton's firm was tasked with guarding Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. The reason Pinkerton was chosen was he actually supplied spies for the Union Army before he was protecting the president. His people were protecting the president. And he was very good at it. He used spies, mostly female spies, who became very close with, we'll just leave it at that, many of the Confederate officers, high-ranking officers, who would then tell these spies what some of their plans were, where they were going the next day, what they might be doing, how many men they were taking. They were bravado. They were bragging about things they were going to do. And these spies then would take the information back to Mr. Pinkerton's office, who would then share it with General George McClellan, who was the commanding general of Union forces before Ulysses S. Grant. He was the first leader. He was the main general in the U.S. Civil War before Grant. McClellan, unfortunately, didn't really think intelligence was something that he needed when it came to fighting the Confederates. He was a pure West Point type of warrior. He only needed to know how to fight. He didn't need to have all this intel. Therefore, he didn't use the intel properly. And McClellan suffered a series of very major defeats, and many, many, many hundreds and thousands of people died because of his bad decisions, because he didn't use the intel that was given to him, and that's been proven. Because of all those failures, McClellan was challenged by Lincoln as to why he was losing all of his battles, and one of the reasons he gave was that Pinkerton was not giving him proper information, and so Pinkerton and McClellan were both fired by Lincoln at the same time, and Grant was brought in to the Union Army to lead the Union Army. Now, at the time, because Pinkerton had been trusted to provide the intel, he was also entrusted to be Lincoln's bodyguard, he and his firm, and they had actually some very interesting ways of getting Lincoln around, sneaking him into cities on trains and things like that. It's well documented. They did a fantastic job of protecting a president during a war that was going on his own soil. But when he was fired, the protection of President Lincoln was turned over to the Washington, D.C. police. And we kind of all know how that turned out, since Mr. Lincoln didn't make it but a few days after the end of the war, before he was assassinated under the protection of the Washington, D.C. police. So we kind of have a little bit of history on physical security and Holmes and his tie-in with the telephone company, and the telephone company then kind of taken off with that alarm system idea once they had the patent and they had the wires. We know about personnel security. We understand the impact of people like Allan Pinkerton and others who were working with the military, working for the government, and realistically were private security before there was public security when it came to protecting dignitaries and providing military intelligence. Which leads us to informational security, which obviously is somewhat new, although there were forms, obviously, of informational security during the Second World War and even the First. You could say that messengers in protected cases during the American Revolution was a form of informational security, although very rudimentary. But generally speaking, 9/11 and the hit at the World Trade Center and other places gave tremendous rise to the use of technology, right? We actually understood in 2001, obviously, our computer systems were very robust by that time even, right? Not nearly what they are today, but quite robust. But we also understood the use of technology in that attack. And electronic security designers tasked with not just private product protections, but also protecting critical digital infrastructures. So the whole idea that terrorism was on the rise and a major terrorism attack hit really opened the eyes to the U.S. government that our digital infrastructures were quite vulnerable, right? And I think they saw that at least they thought they saw the threat was going to be that terrorists would try to break into digital infrastructures protecting things like nuclear power plants and other critical systems, and that infrastructure was going to be terrorized through those cyber systems. That really didn't happen. I mean, it happens, obviously, right? There are hackers that try to get into those types of systems, but we didn't really see that disruption of power, disruption of water systems, disruption of supply chains through terrorism coming from cyber attacks. What we did see was a huge rise in cybercrime to fund terrorism. So the terrorists obviously need money, right? They are trying to raise conventional armies in many cases. And the way they get their money, a lot of it is through cybercrime and counterfeiting, which actually they try to do through cyber means. So basically, it wasn't so much the direct attacks to the cyber systems of infrastructure as much as it was individual attacks on individuals who would give money in some unknowing way to fund terrorism. And so the focus of cyber intelligence in many ways turned to white-collar crime. And that became a more important part of the triad when it came to cybersecurity. And if you look at the protection of personally identifiable information that I discussed earlier, it kind of fits the bill. We're protecting people and people's individual wealth and individual well-being. Now, we're protecting infrastructure, obviously, right? I mean, we're not forgetting about that stuff. I actually have a speaker coming in soon to discuss the systems they use to protect nuclear power plants. But we don't find those attacks being nearly as impactful as first thought they would be back in the early 2000s. It turned to cyber crime to support the funding of terrorism in other ways. And that is really where we're focusing most of our informational security today. So we've seen the advance of physical security, obviously, right? We're not out there with clubs anymore. We've got advanced systems. We've seen the advances in personnel security, probably because of record keeping and obviously the availability of electronic networks to help with that, and the way our response forces are trained and the tools they have. And we've seen obviously the vast rapid fire change of informational security over time, although that will slow. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, we ramped up very, very quickly to protect ourselves, like I said, from critical infrastructure attacks, which, we were able to either prevent, and they didn't come at the rate that the intelligence at the time thought they would. But now we're really chasing that cybercrime because, and we chase the cybercrime for individual companies to protect that company's livelihood and to protect their employees. But make no mistake, a lot of that money is to fund terrorism when it's, when the cybercrime happens. And so that is the major focus, at least of our government. So we've seen all this positive advance in the security world, but there's a dark side of history that's still out there that I found quite interesting, and I thought I'd share as part of this lecture, and that is the railroad police. Railroad police are a private deputized force tasked with protecting railroad property and assets. So think about all the rail yards. If you've ever flown out of O'Hare Airport and you look down, there's these huge train yards. There's a huge one in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. There certainly is outside of Memphis. There's another one outside of St. Louis. Most major cities, when you fly out of the airport, you will see a rail port, if you will. And there is a private security force called the Railroad Police, and there's a separate federal act protecting them. They have total arrest powers, without warrant in some cases, on railroad property and adjoining properties. Now, they've been around since the 1860s, 1870s, and they were always the railroad bulls, right? Big, hulking, aggressive types. They could fight and shoot, and basically they would take the hardest of the hard, and that's who would become the railroad police. And empowered by the Railroad Policing Act of 1865, they're privately paid, they can arrest you, and they have a reputation for acting violently to bring people under arrest. States don't have oversight. Only one state, Illinois, has passed a law that gives the state oversight of railway police. The rest of them are on their own because there is no law governing their activity other than the 1865 Act. So while I was doing research on this, I just found this to be very interesting. And since 2009, railroad police have arrested more than 300 residents in Overtown, which is a predominantly black neighborhood in Miami, on charges of trespassing on railroad property. Now, 90% of those charges had been dismissed when they go to court because the court system is outside of the railroad's purview. But people were simply crossing the tracks to get to work, to go home from somewhere. These were not people who were trying to steal things out of rail cars, to disrupt the railway in any operation. These were people who were crossing the tracks. And they arrested 300 people in one neighborhood for crossing the tracks. Many of these people reported being physically abused under the process of being arrested. In 2010, a Union Pacific Railroad officer was captured on video choking a woman he accused of trespassing and resisting arrest. Now, trespassing is not a violent crime. Resisting arrest can be a violent crime, but if you're resisting a trespassing, I would venture to say that having a picture of the person, identifying them later, and then going through some sort of a process to get a court order to have them arrested later is probably the best advice I would give someone who is new to the policing game. But caught on video is not something that happens at railroad places often, right? I mean, and I can only imagine how many times it's happened. There is no training required by law, okay? They do a background check normally, and that's done in Florida through the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They require anyone who carries a badge in Florida. That is one state that, although they don't have a specific act for the railroad police, anyone who carries a badge in the state of Florida needs to have a background check. Great idea, right? Let's use personnel security to our advantage. But they basically do the background check, they either approve or deny, and that's it. They send it off. 30 years later, that same cop could still be on the job with no further background check. And we don't know if they've been trained. We don't know if they've had weapons training. We don't know anything about what they do other than at the time of hire, they did not have a disqualifying factor on a background check. My point being is that, as we think about, and there's a second assignment for this week that I want to talk about. I want you to think about, we had a discussion about the reputation of private security and how it falls in with police. And the railroad police, for all intents and purposes, are a private security organization. Yes, they have arrest powers, but we know nothing about them, and they don't fall under the purview of every other control that we have over police activity. And so I want you to use them in the back of your mind as part of the model for the second part of the assignment. Let's do a quick recap, though. Security is a basic human need, and we showed that with Fred. Resource protection is the original driver. Fred needed a club to thwart the dangers of Gladys, right? Resource protection, you'll see that term used again. It is the process of mitigating risks based on the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the assets. Threats, vulnerabilities, assets. You'll hear that a lot this term. We'll add in sensitivities later, but let's just concentrate on threats, vulnerabilities, and assets, right? Private security mitigates the risks using the triad, the physical, the personnel, and the informational security. And we use the tools in each one of those toolboxes as a way to mitigate the risks that we identify through threats, vulnerabilities, and assets. Private security predates law enforcement by centuries, and private forces were the model for public ones. I think there's a general perception among the public in the world today that private security is an offshoot of the police that private companies did, later after they tried to get their own private police forces. frankly, it is by historical record the other way around. Police forces were formed after watching private security forces, and the government decided they would do it themselves for whatever reason. And in some cases, that was a great idea. In other cases, I'm not so sure. Alan Pinkerton and Edwin Holmes and others refined the systems and processes we use today, but they're usually they generally are the same types of processes, just modernized. Now, private security today is not without controversy, and lack of oversight, as we saw with the railroad police, is a real issue. And I want you to remember that when you're working on the assignment for this week. So, for this week, you watched the lecture. You've done that. You're done. Wasn't too long, 40 minutes, not bad. There is a quiz this week. It's due on Sunday at 11:59. It's in D2L. It's obviously open notebook and open slides, because I'm not coming to your house to look over your shoulder. There is reading, and it is just a little bit more in depth about the history that I talked about, but please do the reading before you take the quiz, because it may impact your score. There are test banks, as I've told you before, so not everybody will get the same quiz. There are probably 4 or 5 different versions that will pop up. So read it. I think you can probably skim it, though. I mean, I don't want you to waste time. But if you like anything about history, and it's a pretty easy read. It's one chapter, I think about 12 pages. Now, next Monday when we meet, I want you to do this. I want you to consider this thought problem. Private security has a poor reputation, and we discussed that in class, right? Even amongst the members of the class, the rankings were nowhere near where I think they should be at some point. But I think I think you were being quite fair. I think, the reputation is well earned. Now, cybersecurity has a better reputation right now, but history tends to repeat itself. Cybersecurity wasn't around 30 years ago, really. I mean, in any robust fashion. And it is kind of the darling right now, but something else will come up. And cybersecurity has the potential to be lumped in with the rest of private security that we saw by our own little mini experiment in class didn't fare so well on the reputational scale. And certainly not when it comes to comparisons to police departments and others. So what I'd like you to do, if you're a Homeland or corporate major, I'd like you to just list 3 things the private security industry should be doing right now to repair that current reputational challenge. Obviously, if you have a poor reputation, you want to fix that. And if our reputation in private security is floundering some, and it is, we've proven that, what are we going to do? It's incumbent upon us to fix that. Now, cybersecurity majors and minors, I want you to list 3 things the cybersecurity industry should be doing right now to prevent that reputational slide. Because something else shiny will come up. It's just inevitable. History is history. And 30 years from now, when most of you are at the twilight of your careers in cybersecurity, right? Assuming things stay as they are and you work until you're almost 60 years old, 30, 40 years from now, you may be in the same reputational boat with the rest of security because something else has come up. I mean, what is it? Heck, if I knew that, I'd be a very rich man. If I were a guessing man, I'd say it has something to do with space, since that seems to be the focus of many of our elite class right now is get to Mars, and I think that's kind of cool. But something else will come up in the security space, and you have that opportunity to fall victim to the same reputational challenges. What should you be doing right now? If you're a cybersecurity manager, what should you be concentrating on with your team to make sure that your reputation stays pristine? If you are a major other than Homeland Corporate Security or cybersecurity and computer science people, please do the cybersecurity one. But I know we got a biologist and I think we got a criminologist in the crowd. Pick one. Pick whichever one you want to do. I want you to bring that list to class next week because we're going to talk about it a little bit, because part of our challenge is if we know that there's a problem, it's incumbent upon us as academics to try to fix it. So we're going to have that discussion. With that, quiz by Sunday. You finish the lecture. do the reading, and make that list with 3 things. And you are done for the week. Very easy week for you this week, but some things to think about. And I will see you next Monday. Have a great week.